Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Jiang Rui in Beijing. Fidel Castro, Cuba's revolutionary leader, has died at age 90. An icon of the 20th century, the lawyer turned guerrilla fighter turned communist leader of the Caribbean island nation outlived many of his critics as well as many of his would-be assassins. President Xi Jinping, in a meaningful tribute, called him a close comrade and good friend of the Chinese people. So, what is the lasting legacy of the man responsible for the overthrow of the corrupt Batista regime in 1959? In what state has he left his country, now presided over by his brother Raul Castro? And with Cuba's rapprochement with the neighbor and longtime adversary, the United States, how is the country's future shaping up today? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Wang Peng, Research Fellow of the Institute of Latin American Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and author and columnist Anna Tangen. But before we begin our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Love him or loathe him, none can deny the legend of Fidel Castro. Castro was born August 13, 1926. As a young man, he was inspired by Cuban independence hero Jose Marti's passionate nationalism and calls for Latin American unity. A charismatic speaker, Castro soon emerged as one of the leaders in the growing movement against the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. By the late 1950s, Mr. Castro was leading a large guerrilla force in Cuba. Over Batista's forces brought Castro into power in 1959. He quickly began steering the country toward communism while he fostered a close alliance with the Soviet Union, a policy that put himself at odds with the United States. Throughout his life, Castro survived hundreds of assassination attempts, a U.S.-backed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1960, and a standoff with Washington over Soviet missiles that pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war in 1962.
Toda mi vida he querido en los cambios.
Of course, I have all my life believed in changes.
Si los problemas que nos hemos buscado es por eso.
Our problems are precisely because we are always changing.
Pero cambios hacia adelante,
But
no hacia
changing towards the future, ahead, not backwards.
Though hated by some, Fidel Castro is seen by many as the man who overthrew a corrupt, dictatorial system and to embody the identity of his nation. As he reshaped his country, Castro became a beacon of solidarity for activists across the Third World as he backed revolutionary movements in Latin America and Africa. With his bushy beard and olive green fatigues, Castro was for decades a living symbol of Cuba's socialist revolution. The robust image lingered long after the beard turned white and scraggly. However, the defiance endured.
No me importa la forma en que muera.
I don't care how I die, but rest assured, if they invade us, I'll die in combat. Thank you.
An ailing Fidel Castro formally resigned in 2011 after about a half-century in power. His younger brother Raul replaced him as the leader of Cuba. Though Castro has been heavily criticized by governments, especially in the West, he has enjoyed great support inside Cuba. No one can deny that Castro was one of the most extraordinary political figures of the 20th century and the man who put Cuba on the map.
Mr. Wang, what do you think of his image and legacy?
So basically, I think there are three major legacies. First, he forged the first socialist country in the Western Hemisphere. I think this socialist country is not dependent on any major power, even the Soviet Union. So as we know, the Soviet Union has collapsed in 1991, but Cuba, another socialist regime, has outlived it for many years. So I think the second legacy is a very quality welfare system in Cuba. It's a big achievement. We know that there is a very wide gap of wealth distribution in regional countries. So in Cuba, it's very different after the revolution succeeded in 1959. Right now, Cuban people enjoy universal education, quality health care, very good employment. So this welfare system really works, even though Cuba has fallen into economic crisis in the early 1990s. So the government really do its best to promote this welfare system. So that's I think based on it, I find the third legacy. This legacy is kind of sustained pressure on other regional countries. So Cuba is a good example. Cuba has established this welfare system, although it's still a small economy, its GDP per capita is still low, but there is such a very good welfare system. So other regional countries, they have to face this reality. They cannot find any excuse to ignore people's demand for welfare. So I think there are three major legacies.
Anna, your take?
I think what's most important about him is he overthrew a brutal dictator who was involved, in just mass shootings. He was a tyrant. I don't think anybody is going to say Batista was a good guy, who was actually supported by the U.S. And I think it's most important that he's seen as an iconic figure who was able to resist an overwhelming power, a neighboring power to the north. The socialism came, yes, he was very interested in his country. But I think there's another part of his legacy, and that is those who were revolutionaries are not necessarily great administrators. He founded his country. It became free under him, separate. But in his later years, it did not have the same kind of economic rebirth that, for instance, China had over the last 30 years.
And do you think the spirit of a Cuban revolution will die along with the passing away of the great revolutionary, Mr. Fidel Castro?
I think it will not die. It will be transformed. First, we have to find a solution to overthrow the dictatorship. Then we have to find a way to establish a society based on the fairly distributed wealth. Third, we have to find a new generation of revolution in order to promote the economic efficiency.
You have been using the word of a revolutionary, but a major ruling party like either the Cuban or the Chinese one should have been transformed itself from a revolutionary party to a ruling party. Now, if you use the word revolution, it means it will still use the black and white terms in examining the present-day world, and that'll be twisting your perception of the true reality. What do you think of our concern?
I think you're right, and this is one of the major flaws, and I think his brother is now trying to remedy that, but in very, very small steps. He's trying to bring it into a ruling party, which means putting the welfare. But let us put this in context. The fact is, here was a man who was constantly under threat of assassination from the U.S., who was constantly feeding infiltrators into the system with the express purpose of overthrowing his government or killing him. So he was in a wartime mode from almost all the period that he was alive. The embargoes, everything was aimed at bringing down his administration. Now, one of the most important things that I should have mentioned earlier is that he created a dark shadow for the U.S. because all of the efforts of the U.S. on there brought a lot of attention to what the U.S. was doing in other parts of South America. And I think it unified a lot of them saying, look, we really don't want the U.S. interfering in our affairs. I mean, it's an amazing fact. When the Conference of Americas was held, Obama was told in no uncertain terms that unless Cuba is invited, you're not invited. Mm-hmm. And that was the precipitating factor that went into Cuba actually being, at the timing of it. He had been working on it, but the timing of it came away. So you're seeing there aren't many times when South America comes together, but they did come together on this issue. And I think this is a very important point that people should be looking at.
A very intriguing part of the myth, gentlemen, is why, given the severity of the ideological hostility between the two major blocs, this former Soviet Union and the United States, and despite the invasion of the Bay of Pigs as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, this small island nation failed to be conquered by such a military superpower, the United States, and despite the devastating number of failure in carrying out political assassination against Fidel Castro by a notorious CIA during the Cold War. Why do you think miraculously Fidel Castro, along with the spirit of the Cuban Revolution, have been able to survive so much vicissitudes?
I think it's more like his political position, his economic are responding to the native demand. It's from Cuba. His ideas, it's not imported from any other countries. Basically, this guy, Fidel Castro, is a nationalist. He wants to safeguard the political independence of this country. He wants to reform this country.
There's no doubt about the domestic popularity of this populist charisma, Fidel Castro. However, what do you think of the allegation that following the 1962 missile crisis, a secret agreement may have been reached between President JFK and Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, that A, Cuba should not be overthrown militarily. B, American missiles should be withdrawn from Turkey and Greece as a result of terminating the nuclear arsenal in Cuba, which of course was deployed by the former Soviet Union. What do you think of this allegation?
This allegation, I think, is a kind of failure for the Cuban diplomacy at that time, because Fidel Castro wants to resist the U.S. pressure, but finally he found the Soviet Union decided to give up, to make a recession. So I think that's a
make a concession.
Yes, but Fidel Castro really wanted to take a tough, hard line on the United States on this issue.
But this wasn't his best hour. He was literally saying to the Russians, use them, these missiles. He wanted a confrontation. Now, that's quite a change, because just after the revolution, he did in fact go to the United States, and he sought an audience with Eisenhower, who refused to see him. And then based on that, he was almost pushed into the arms, because at that time, a Cold War ideology, he was pushed into the arms of the Soviets.
Are you saying following the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro went to the United States in an effort to seek reconciliation,
yes,
to seek a representation with the American government, but he was given a cold shoulder?
He was very cold shoulder. They refused to meet him.
Do you think today there is an ongoing debate, if any, among American scholars as to why they have lost Cuba?
No, the debate is, unfortunately, it's very difficult to have a debate about this issue, in particular because of the 5% of the electorate in Florida, which is a swing state.
In Miami.
In Miami, but it's statewide, it's 5%. This is a very, very crucial. No one wants to alienate them, and they have basically said, we want no discussion. Fidel Castro is evil, he's horrible, and everything else was okay. They don't really go back into the history of Batista, what was happening there. The U.S. Not only passive support of that regime, but also sending troops down to put down riots, especially in the sugarcane fields that were owned by foreign interests. So it was not a good time, but there has not been any kind of real growth in terms of examining this period and what should have been happening.
Peng, what do you think of the immediate response from the president-elect, Donald Trump? On Twitter, he said simply, Fidel Castro is dead. But in the official statement, he described Castro as a dictator, brutal dictatorship. What do you think of what's going to happen between Washington and Havana in the ensuing years?
Yeah, it's a big issue to discuss. It's an issue of common concern. Just now, I have discussed this topic with Mr. Tengen. So we have to wait, Mr. East, to to sever of the diplomatic ties between the United States and Cuba. He wants to reestablish the agreement between the United States and Cuba. He has made a lot of promises.
Campaign pledges should not be taken very seriously. Anna, don't you think so? For example, would this president-elect construct a physical war along the Mexican border, as he said on the campaign trail? Would he withdraw American nuclear, its allies such as ROK and Japan? We have many questions, tons of questions for this president-elect. That's why we say, should we take his campaign pledge very seriously?
Well, the problem is that there are some people who are taking his campaign pledges very seriously, and they've started to attack him on those. When he did not, he said, put Hillary in jail, famously many times. When he said, I'm not going to do it, the right-wing group, Breitbart, and the chief among who's now going to be joining his administration, attacked him. He's betrayed us, right? So if there are not enough campaign pledges kept, it will make him look just like any other politician. Now, he ran on the basis that I'm a straight shooter, I tell you the truth, I tell you the way it is. And it's obviously not going to be the case.
Mr. Trump will reject the TPP anyway, but you are watching Dialogue with Mr. Wang Peng, a senior research fellow with the CAS, and Anna Tangen, our regular commentator. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back. What is interesting is the immediate public response towards the death of Fidel Castro here in China, which is supposed to be ideologically a close friend. If you look at, of course, the message of condolence from President Xi Jinping, of course he's an old friend of China and a revolutionary soldier. But what do you think of the divided public opinions here in the Chinese society? If you look at the social media, public opinion is seriously divided, with those who described him as a dictator and can be compared to some of the regime they don't like the PRK and during the Cold War, Phnom Penh, the bloody regime of Pol Pot, the dictatorship, which was unfortunately supported by the then Chinese authorities in its relationship with Hanoi. I'm not talking about this, but what do you think of those who are so positively praising him and those who criticize him in this parallel comparison with the dictators?
Yes, I think so. There is a very sharp division among Chinese people on how do they think of Fidel Castro. It's reasonable. I think some people
really. I'm going to interrupt you there. I can't see it as reasonable. These other two brutal dictators, and the way they treated their people, were highly unpopular. All right. But I shouldn't say that about Kim. It appears on the surface it's very popular.
Right, so the regime many
Chinese don't like. If you look at the demographics of the people who continue to support his idea and the spirit of what he represented, half of them were born after the revolution, and they still support him, and he's been very popularized. You have 9 days of mourning. There are people there who are genuinely saddened by the passing of this era. I personally would find it very offensive to put them in the same camps. Did bad things happen? Yes, absolutely. But once again, he was in a wartime situation with a huge active power constantly trying to kill him or bring his administration down.
Mr. Wang, let's, if I can I draw a difference between communism and nationalism, which may be closely related to the idea of utopianism and egalitarianism? That is the state policy that Fidel Castro has been practicing for decades, over perhaps the past half a century, in terms of free education and very good healthcare welfare policies. Dividends that are shared also by brothers and sisters in the neighborhood of Latin America. So can you tell me briefly if there are any differences between nationalism and communism with regard to the realities in the Fidel years?
I think this difference is really a complex issue to discuss. So I just want to tell you something very concrete, that is very concrete. So different from other countries, Cuba never closed its border. There is no massacre in Cuba. There is no starvation in this country. This country is always open to the world. So there is economic blockade from the United States. It's the United States who has prevented its people to go to Cuba. And Cuba always allows people to go to the United States. So as we know, in 1980, I think is the year.
Excuse me, are you saying there was no such an equivalent of a Berlin Wall between Cuba and Miami?
Yeah, I think so.
No invisible or visible barrier?
If you were caught trying to immigrate in a boat and you were brought back, you would be sent to jail. I don't think there's any question about that. It's not that they, quote, had closed borders. It's just that they didn't want people leaving. Now, in 1991, when the Soviet Union, because of the fall of the wall and their own problems, started withdrawing economic support, there were quite a few people who did, in fact, cross over and claim to be political refugees when they were really economic refugees. Things were very, very tough in that period of time. I think we go back to this issue. It was a revolutionary government that failed to transform into a leading government body. And that will probably be the negative side of his legacy. Not all of these claims that cater or anything like that. The people he killed were mostly aligned with our interests from the U.S. period, who were trying to literally overthrow him on a daily basis.
When President Obama decided to lift the economic sanctions and to resume official ties with Havana, he said something like, look, 50 years of economic sanctions and isolation didn't work. Therefore, his government decided to adopt a normal relationship. So, but the other issue, Mr. Wang, is why do you think Cuba serves as a source of inspirations for many other left-wing countries in South America?
So that's a very important issue to analyze. So we have to understand what happened in this region, Latin America. Latin America is very different from North America. This part of these regional countries are really tortured by the big gap between the rich and the poor. So I think the most important that Fidel Castro has done is to figure out a solution to his own domestic problem. This big gap between the rich and the poor. I think this solution is not perfect. Right now, we can see the economic efficiency in this country is not good. Many well-educated Cuban people just tried to go to the United States to find economic opportunities. So we know they are economic immigrants. They are not leaving their country because of political problems. So this country has this good solution to its social problem. That's why it's a good example for other leftist rulers in this region.
Other than the strong factor of ideology, which is a legacy of the Cold War, do you think exporting medical workers and assistance to neighboring countries from Havana has rallied many friendly South American countries behind Havana, and they are also motivated by their anti-American sentiments, anti-hegemony sentiments?
So I think those doctors are kind of comparative advantage of Cuba. Cuba is really good at medical technology, so it wants to help other regional countries to develop their medical service. So it's a kind of economic exchange. I think it's reasonable. So regional countries need those help from Cuba. Venezuela is a good case.
In different forms, Anna, scholars in particular are still commemorating the iconic figure of Che Guevara, a very close friend of Fidel Castro in the years of revolution. There's a joke. Many tourists from around the world go to Havana for the sake of seeing three men: Ernest Hemingway, Fidel Castro, and of course Che Guevara. Do you agree? If not for the sake of buying cigars.
Well, he was certainly a life character that has been idealized, but I mean, the business of revolution shouldn't be. It's sometimes a necessity when you're faced with brutal circumstances, and the people rise up because there's really nothing else that they can do. But that's an internal change. It's not a change that's being forced on them by other ideologies or groups within their area. In terms of Che Guevara, he was a revolutionary. He never stopped being a revolutionary. As soon as the action died down, he wanted to export their brand across the things. I think in the end, if you look at Che Guevara and you look at the doctors from Cuba who were in over 120 countries around the world helping people, I think the 120, the doctors who went abroad are probably the better people. They're the people that we should commemorate and probably go see.
Che Guevara is obviously a hero of Hugo Chavez, a late leader of Venezuela. But what do you think of the message sent by Monsieur Hollande, the French president. What did he say? Why he seemed to be so highly, praising Fidel Castro and his legacy, particularly Prime Minister Modi of India?
Yeah, I think Fidel Castro should be remembered by people just because of his efforts for resolving these social problems. Hugo Chavez is deeply affected by him, so he made all his efforts on resolving social problems. But both of them are not really good, are not well performed in economic growth, so that's a problem.
Is it because ideological reasons that economies in both Venezuela and Cuba are faltering, if not falling apart? In the age of opening up, don't you think economy in Cuba would not be sustainable anyway?
It's currently not sustainable. They have to import. They do well when they have a sponsoring nation. First when there was USSR, then it was Venezuela and goes. But in terms of the remarks by leaders around the world, the one that struck me most actually was the one from Trudeau in Canada. He said, although controversial, all right, there's no mistaking the fact of the love of his people for him and genuine respect. I think that captures a lot of what's out there. I don't think Donald Trump's or Pence's rather very odd statements, calling him a brutal dictator and all those things, is either very politic or very useful.
Certainly no one would seriously associate what Deng Xiaoping did with the return of Guantanamo. Deng Xiaoping took Hong Kong back, but what would happen to Guantanamo, a place where POWs were abused, allegedly? It was reported by the American media, and for that, the First Amendment deserves credit. Thank you very much for your presence on this enlightening edition of Dialogue. With that, we come to the end of this very interesting brainstorming about the legacy and image of Fidel Castro, who died at age 90. I'll see you. Goodbye.